I knew something was wrong the moment the screen lit up with my face. Not a candid photo. Not a polite introduction. A professionally lit image. Cropped perfectly. My name beneath it in bold letters. Lot number 7. The ballroom at the Scottsdale Grand Meridian shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Gold light reflecting off champagne glasses and polished marble floors. Daniel stood center stage beside the CEO. Tailored tuxedo flawless. Posture relaxed. When my picture filled the LED wall behind him, he didn't hesitate. "Gentlemen," he said into the microphone, smiling like this was clever, like this was charming. "Let's make this one interesting." Laughter rolled across the room. The caption under my photo read, "Strategic Partner Experience." Someone at the front table raised a bidding paddle. 25,000. The auctioneer called brightly. I hadn't agreed to any experience. And when I saw printed bid sheets already sitting neatly at the VIP tables, with my name pre-listed, I realized this wasn't an impulsive joke. It was planned. The jazz trio kept playing softly in the corner, unaware that something inside me had gone very still. This was Whitmore Technologies' pre-IPO gala, the final show of unity before the public announcement that would turn Daniel into a headline and the family business into a publicly traded company. I had attended dozens of these events beside him, smiled when appropriate, shaken hands, played the supportive wife. 2 years earlier, I had stepped back from my corporate law career at Daniel's suggestion. Cleaner optics, he'd said. Less conflict of interest while we prepare for the IPO. Cleaner. The bidding climbed to 40,000. Daniel lifted his glass in appreciation. "She's a good sport," he joked. "Always supportive of the company." Supportive. Someone called out. "Hope she agreed to this." Daniel didn't miss a beat. "She trusts me." Trust? The word struck harder than the laughter. I moved closer to the side of the stage instead of retreating toward the exit. If this was a performance, I wanted to see the script. The description under my photo shifted slightly. Executive access experience. Fine print scrolled beneath it. Includes strategic advisory session. Advisory session. I wasn't just being auctioned as entertainment. I scanned the tables. The men raising paddles weren't random guests. They were primary stakeholders. Venture capital partners. Board members. The people who would vote on governance structures before Whitmore went public. The bid reached 50,000. I noticed a small legal footnote icon flicker at the bottom of the slide before the screen refreshed. No charity auction needs a legal footnote. A memory surfaced. 3 nights earlier, I had walked past Daniel's office at home. His voice was low, controlled. "Once the spouse clause is secured, we're covered," he had said into his phone. At the time, I assumed he meant his father's will. Charles Whitmore had been revising estate documents. The inheritance structure for the family business was shifting before the IPO. I hadn't pressed for details. I'd been gently excluded from those discussions. "It's board logistics," Daniel had told me. "Nothing you need to worry about." The bidding climbed to 75,000. Applause grew louder. I caught sight of Ryan Whitmore near the lighting rig. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. His eyes weren't on me. They were on Daniel. His jaw was tight. The screen flickered. For half a second. A different file flashed before resetting to the polished auction slide. Spousal liability shield, final draft. My stomach dropped. But my pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Shield. Liability. Final draft. That wasn't romantic. That wasn't playful. That was corporate. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. "Do I hear 80,000? Several paddles rose immediately. Daniel's hand found the small of my back as I reached the stage steps. "Smile," he murmured without looking at me. "It's good for the company." "What exactly am I advising on?" I asked quietly. "Optics," he replied, teeth barely moving. "After tonight, everything changes. Everything changes." The laptop connected to the projector sat open near the side of the stage. As someone backstage adjusted the display, the file tab flashed briefly. Spouse Liability Draft 3. Version 3. meaning revisions, meaning intent. The venture capital partner who had just won the bid approached the stage, grinning. "Looking forward to our governance discussion," he said. Governance. Not dinner. I felt the final piece slide into place. Pre-IPO restructuring. A revised will limiting spousal rights. A liability shield draft. Public documentation of me being tied to executive advisory optics. This wasn't about charity. It was about positioning. If exposure needed insulation before the company went public, if something went wrong after the IPO, if liability had to shift cleanly, then I wasn't being celebrated. I was being documented. The auctioneer gestured toward me. "Let's bring lot number 7 up here." The spotlight swung fully in my direction. Daniel nodded subtly, confident I would play along, instead of stepping back into the shadows, instead of laughing it off. I felt something settle inside me. Clarity. I didn't walk out of that ballroom. I walked toward the microphone. 80,000, the auctioneer declared, his voice bright with triumph. Applause rippled across the ballroom, louder than before. Confident now. The venture capital partner who had raised the final paddle stood and bowed slightly, grinning like he had just secured a rare asset. Daniel lifted his glass toward him. "Generous as always," he said smoothly. "Our partners understand value." Value. The word hung there longer than it should have. I stayed near the stage steps, close enough to see the bid sheets more clearly. My name wasn't scribbled in as a last-minute novelty. It was printed in bold at the top of each page, followed by a structured description. There were bullet points: strategic visibility, executive advisory access, governance discussion. This had been drafted, reviewed, approved. I wasn't an accident. I glanced back at the LED screen. The phrasing shifted again. Executive access experience. The charity branding was shrinking in size. The corporate language was growing. Daniel leaned into the microphone once more. "For those of you who don't know," he said with a charming half-smile, "my wife has always been my secret weapon. Brilliant legal mind. Loyal. Discreet. Loyal. Discreet." The applause came again. Softer this time. More calculated. "Hope she signed off on this," someone joked from a back table. Daniel didn't hesitate. "She trusts me." Trust. I felt something inside me go quiet. A junior associate approached with a champagne flute. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it to me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Congratulations," he murmured. "On what?" I asked. He hesitated. "On the engagement." Engagement. The word didn't fit. I looked back at the screen just as a small legal footnote symbol blinked at the bottom before disappearing again. It was subtle, almost invisible beneath the lighting. "No charity auction needs a footnote." 3 nights earlier, Daniel had been pacing in his home office. "Once the spouse clause is secured, we're covered," he had said into his phone. At the time, I assumed it was about his father's will. Charles Whitmore had been revising estate documents, shifting inheritance rights within the family business before the IPO. I hadn't pushed to be included in those conversations. I had trusted him. The bidding had stopped. But the energy in the room hadn't. The investors weren't laughing now. They were studying me. I noticed something else. Every person who had raised a paddle held significant equity in Whitmore Technologies. Not casual donors. Not friends. Primary stakeholders. This wasn't about entertainment. It was about optics. I moved closer to the stage instead of retreating. If I was being displayed, I wanted to see the entire structure. "What exactly am I advising on?" I asked Daniel quietly. He didn't look at me directly. "It's symbolic," he murmured through his smile. "Investors like engagement." Engagement with what? He leaned slightly closer. "After tonight. The board signs off?" "Signs off on what?" He didn't answer. Behind him, the screen flickered for half a second. The polished slide vanished and another file flashed into view before someone backstage corrected it. "Spousal liability shield, final draft." My skin prickled. Shield. Liability. Final draft. The laptop connected to the projector sat open at the side of the stage. For a brief moment, I saw the file tab clearly before it disappeared. Spouse Liability Draft 3. Version 3. That meant revisions. Deliberate changes. The venture capital partner who had won approached the stage with an amused grin. Looking forward to our governance discussion, he said to me. Governance. Not dinner. Not charity. Ryan Whitmore appeared at the edge of the stage under the pretense of adjusting the lighting cables. He leaned in just enough for his words to reach me. You didn't know about this, did you? He asked quietly. I didn't respond. He exhaled through his nose. You should review the revised spouse provision. Before I could question him, he stepped away, blending back into the shadows near the tech crew. The auctioneer laughed into the microphone. Let's hear it for Mrs. Whitmore. Applause filled the room again, but it sounded hollow now. I scanned the faces at the tables. Some were amused. Some were cautious. A few looked nervous. I glanced at the fine print scrolling beneath my image one more time. Includes advisory access. Public representation event? The phrase hit differently this time. Public representation event. If Whitmore Technologies was weeks away from going public, and if liability insulation clauses were being finalized, and if tonight publicly documented my presence as a strategic partner, then this wasn't a joke. It was documentation. Daniel placed his hand lightly at my back again, guiding me toward the center of the stage. Smile, he whispered. It's good for the company. For the company, I looked at the investors holding their paddles. I looked at the screen flashing corporate language disguised as charity. I looked at my husband smiling like this was harmless. And I realized something with absolute certainty. I wasn't being auctioned for fun. I was being positioned as insulation. The spotlight tightened around me. Instead of stepping into it obediently, I felt something inside me sharpen. If this was a performance, it wasn't going to go the way he expected. I reached for the microphone. I took the microphone before Daniel could stop me. The metal felt cool in my hand. Solid. Real. The ballroom quieted in uneven waves, laughter fading into uncertain murmurs. Daniel's fingers brushed my wrist. Subtle but urgent. Don't, he whispered through a smile that no longer reached his eyes. I adjusted the mic slightly and faced the room. Before this continues, I said calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I just need to clarify something. A few awkward chuckles floated up from the tables. I let the silence stretch. Then I looked directly at the massive LED screen behind us. Wait, I said, clear and measured. Do you really think I don't know anything? That stopped them. Not the words themselves. The tone. I turned back to the audience. For those of you who may not know me beyond tonight's listing, I practiced corporate law for nearly a decade before stepping back 2 years ago. My focus was IPO compliance and liability structuring. A ripple moved through the room. Heads turned. A few investors straightened in their chairs. Daniel laughed softly into his mic. She's being dramatic, he said lightly. Old habits. I didn't look at him. Phrases like strategic advisory access. I continued. And public representation event aren't casual language. They're deliberate. The room shifted. I gestured toward the screen. And when I see a file titled Spousal Liability Shield, Final Draft, I pay attention. For a split second, no one breathed. Daniel stepped closer. That was a draft, he said quickly. Internal discussion. Nothing finalized. Then let's finalize clarity, I replied evenly. I glanced toward the tech operator near the side of the stage. Could you pull up the slide that flashed a moment ago? The operator froze, eyes darting toward Daniel. Leave it, Daniel snapped quietly. Too late. The screen flickered. The polished charity graphic disappeared, and for a heartbeat, the wrong file appeared before someone tried to override it. Spousal Liability Shield Final Draft. There it was. Visible. Real. A low murmur spread across the ballroom like a crack in glass. I spoke before the slide vanished again. A liability shield, I said calmly. in pre-IPO structuring is typically used to compartmentalize risk. It protects primary executives and shareholders from potential regulatory exposure. I paused. It shifts that exposure somewhere else. Daniel reached for the mic, but I angled slightly away from him. This evening, I continued, I was presented as an executive access experience, a strategic partner. In front of stakeholders weeks before a public offering, I let the implication settle. Is tonight about charity? I asked softly. Or documentation? Someone coughed. A glass clinked nervously against a plate. Daniel leaned toward me. You're misinterpreting internal drafts. Am I? I asked. Earlier that afternoon, I had opened his laptop to print our dinner reservations. A document auto-synced to the shared drive. Contingent spouse clause. I hadn't meant to read it. But I had. The clause referenced public representation events and liability alignment. I looked back at the audience. I came across a clause this afternoon referencing public representation events tied to spousal exposure. Daniel's jaw tightened. Exposure to what? I asked the room. The venture capital partner who had won the bid lowered his paddle slowly onto the table. Daniel tried to regain control. This is emotional revenge, he said sharply. She's embarrassed. I met his gaze fully for the first time that night. No, I said. This is informed consent. The air felt different now. Heavier. More precise. I scanned the room and caught Ryan's eyes. He gave the smallest nod. I turned slightly back toward the microphone. And this isn't the only document that concerns me, I said. Daniel stiffened. My father-in-law revised his will 6 weeks ago. I continued. At the same time, liability insulation drafts were being updated. A few investors exchanged looks. Estate planning before an IPO isn't unusual, I added calmly. But removing spousal leverage from governance review while drafting liability shields is strategic. Daniel stepped forward again. That's family business. Yes, I agreed quietly. It is. Silence. The jazz trio had stopped playing without anyone noticing. I held the microphone steady. If tonight is harmless, I said, then transparency shouldn't be a problem. No one laughed now. No one clapped. They watched. Daniel's composure, so carefully built over years, began to fracture in small, visible ways. The tightness around his mouth, the tension in his shoulders. I shifted my weight slightly. And since we're discussing revisions, I added, my voice calm enough to cut cleanly through the room, perhaps we should also discuss the offshore transfer that followed. A sharp intake of breath moved through the crowd. Daniel's face changed. Not anger, not embarrassment, fear. And for the first time that night, I wasn't the one on display. He was. But let's start with something simpler, I said into the microphone. The will. The word landed harder than offshore. The ballroom, already tense, seemed to contract. Even the air felt thinner. Daniel's father, Charles Whitmore, was not just a parent. He was the founder of Whitmore Technologies, the architect of the family business that was weeks away from going public, the man whose signature still controlled majority voting shares. 6 weeks ago, I continued evenly. Charles revised his will. Daniel stepped toward me. That's private. It became public the moment I was auctioned, I replied without raising my voice. A few investors shifted uncomfortably. I am not entitled to inheritance, I clarified. This is not about money. It's about timing. The screen behind us had returned to its polished charity graphic, but no one was looking at it anymore. The prior version of the will, I said, allowed limited spousal review in the event of governance disputes involving executive restructuring. The revised version eliminates that entirely. A murmur rippled across the room. In plain terms, I added, spouses lost oversight, leveraged the same weak liability insulation drafts were updated. Daniel shook his head. You're conflating estate planning with corporate strategy. Am I? I asked. I glanced toward the front tables. The venture capital partner who had raised $80,000 earlier was no longer smiling. The revision was signed quickly. I said, quietly, with minimal discussion. I thought back to the cafe in Old Town Scottsdale a week earlier. Ryan had asked to meet me privately. He had stirred his coffee without drinking it, eyes scanning the room before leaning forward. They need the structure clean before filings, he had said. What does that mean? I had asked. It means spouses complicate liability, he replied. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now I did. Back in the ballroom, I let that memory steady me. I was not consulted, I said calmly. In fact, I was gently excluded from conversations that previously involved me. The word excluded felt heavier spoken aloud. Daniel laughed tightly. You chose to step back from operations. I stepped back from optics, I corrected. Not from comprehension. A few heads nodded. Estate restructuring and liability restructuring occurring simultaneously before an IPO, I continued, is not sentimental. It's strategic. Margaret Sloan rose slowly from her seat near the center table. Her presence alone shifted the dynamic. Was independent estate counsel consulted? She asked Daniel. Daniel hesitated just long enough for it to matter. CEO Harold Bennett cleared his throat. This is neither the time nor the place. It became the place. Margaret interrupted quietly. I held the microphone steady. The week the will removed spousal review rights, I said. I was presented tonight as a strategic advisory experience tied to executive optics. Silence deepened. Coincidences don't require version numbers, I added. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're humiliating your family? He said under his breath. You publicly auctioned me, I replied. The truth of that sat between us. I turned slightly, addressing the room again. I am not accusing anyone of criminal conduct, I said. I am asking whether I knowingly consented to being positioned as insulation. The word insulation seemed to travel through the crowd like static. Ryan stood near the back, arms folded. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he didn't look surprised either. And if this is ordinary estate planning? I continued. Then there should be no issue with transparency. No one objected. The charity banner behind us now looked absurd. I took a slow breath. Now, I said, pivoting deliberately. Let's return to the offshore transfer. The reaction was sharper this time. A few gasps. Someone muttered something under his breath. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The offshore entity was funded 3 days after the revised will was signed. I said clearly. Daniel's composure cracked just slightly. That has nothing to do with her, he said sharply. It references joint marital assets. I answered. That landed. I could feel it. Investors were no longer amused spectators. They were calculating risk. If governance restructuring removes spousal leverage, I said, and liability insulation drafts shift exposure, and offshore entities are funded referencing joint assets. I paused. Then I have the right to ask why. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine. The charm was gone. The Polish had thinned. The ballroom was no longer a stage. It was a tribunal. And for the first time that night, no one was looking at me like lot number 7. They were looking at him like a liability. The offshore entity was funded 3 days after the revised will was signed. I repeated. The words didn't echo. They settled. Daniel stepped forward quickly. That document was preliminary, he said. Internal structuring. Standard practice. Standard for whom? I asked. The room had shifted from curiosity to calculation. Phones were no longer being used to take photos. They were being used to send messages. The entity is registered under a shell corporation. I continued, my voice steady. Not directly in Daniel's name. That part is careful. Daniel's face hardened. But the guarantor clause references joint marital assets. I said, assets I was never informed were being positioned as insulation. A low murmur moved across the ballroom. It's diversification, Daniel insisted. Risk mitigation before going public. Diversification distributes assets, I replied. Displacement distributes liability. That distinction landed. I could see it in the way a few investors leaned forward. Containment, I said, recalling the exact phrase from the document. The clause used the word spousal exposure containment. I let that hang. Contained from what? Daniel reached for the microphone again. You're misrepresenting context. Then provide it, I said calmly. Publicly. CEO Harold stepped in. This is a charity event. It stopped being that, Margaret Sloane said from her table. About 10 minutes ago? Daniel shot her a sharp look. I didn't hack anything, I said. The document synced automatically through our shared system at home. I recognized the language because I used to draft similar structures. I glanced at the crowd. Pre-IPO liability insulation often involves compartmentalizing exposure away from primary executives. If regulatory issues arise, distance matters. The venture capital partner, who had raised $80,000 earlier, slowly placed his paddle flat on the table. But insulation only works, I added, if the buffer consents. Silence deepened. Daniel's composure was slipping now. This is emotional revenge, he said. Louder this time. You're embarrassed and lashing out. I'm informed, I replied. A small movement caught my eye near the back. The outside regulatory counsel, who had been attending as a guest, stepped forward slightly. Arms crossed. I also have context, I said. Daniel froze. Earlier this week, my phone auto-recorded part of a conversation when it activated in my bag. The tension spiked instantly. You wouldn't? Daniel said under his breath. I don't need the whole call, I continued. Just one sentence. I lifted my phone and connected it to the ballroom's audio system before anyone could physically stop me. The clip was short. Daniel's voice, calm and measured, filled the room. Once the spouse clause is active and optics are established, exposure shifts cleanly. The words sounded colder, amplified. A glass shattered somewhere in the room. Daniel stepped forward immediately. That's out of context. Then explain it, I said. No one laughed now. No one applauded. They watched. Ryan moved forward from the back of the room, breaking his silence for the first time. She wasn't supposed to know yet, he said quietly. That was enough. CEO Harold turned sharply toward him. Ryan. But the damage was done. Investors began speaking in low, urgent tones. Words floated through the air. Disclosure. SEC. Filing thresholds. Margaret rose again. Was independent audit counsel consulted before drafting spousal exposure clauses tied to public events? Daniel didn't answer. The regulatory counsel stepped fully into view now. I would recommend reviewing all associated documents immediately, he said evenly. Daniel looked at me, fury and calculation colliding in his expression. You just triggered a federal review, he whispered. You triggered it, I replied quietly. When you drafted my liability without consent. Phones buzzed almost simultaneously around the room. Notifications. Board alerts. I felt my own phone vibrate in my hand. Emergency board session, effective immediately. I looked at the screen. Daniel's name was no longer listed as chair. He saw it too. The ballroom no longer belonged to him. It no longer belonged to the company. It belonged to consequence. The charity banner behind us hung awkwardly above a room that had transformed into something else entirely. The auction had ended. The performance was over. And for the first time that night, Daniel wasn't standing in control of the narrative. He was standing inside it. My phone was still vibrating in my hand when I looked up at Daniel. He had seen the notification too. Emergency board session, effective immediately. His name was no longer listed as chair. The shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. The effortless confidence he had worn all evening cracked at the edges. Around us, conversations fractured into urgent whispers. Investors leaned toward one another, screens glowing in their palms. CEO Harold Bennett was already moving toward a cluster of board members near the back exit. Daniel grabbed my elbow. Not violently, but firmly enough to make a point. We need to talk, he said through clenched teeth. He guided me into a quiet corridor just outside the ballroom. The music had stopped entirely. The muffled hum of tension followed us like static. Do you understand what you've done? He demanded. I asked questions. I replied calmly. You humiliated me in front of partners. You auctioned me in front of them. His jaw tightened. This was governance structuring. Risk mitigation. You don't understand the scale of what was at stake. I understand exactly what you put at stake, I said. He exhaled sharply. You jeopardized the IPO. My position? The company, I repeated. Or your control of it. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. For 2 years, I had been the supportive wife, the one who stepped back from her law practice, the one who nodded through board dinners and didn't ask for access to drafts. You chose to leave your firm, he said. I chose partnership. I corrected, not silence. The hallway lighting felt harsh now, fluorescent and unforgiving. You didn't just use my name tonight. I continued quietly. You used my absence from the room, my exclusion from the drafts, my trust. He looked away first. We were protecting the family business, he said finally. Before going public. Insulation matters. Insulation from what? I asked. Regulatory exposure. Or accountability. He didn't answer. We walked back toward the ballroom together. But it no longer felt like a gala. It felt like the aftermath of something structural. The charity signage was still up, but no one was paying attention to it. Board members were gathering in a private conference suite off to the side. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to containment. Margaret Sloan approached me as Daniel was pulled away by Harold. You changed the trajectory in that room, she said quietly. I didn't intend to, I replied. You prevented something from being signed tonight, she said. They were prepared to approve the restructuring. That made sense now. After tonight, everything changes. Daniel's words echoed differently in my mind. From the partially closed door of the conference suite, raised voices filtered into the hall. Disclosure risk. Spousal exposure. Regulatory optics. Ryan stepped out briefly, his expression controlled but tense. They've suspended the vote, he told me quietly. Temporary removal is being discussed. Temporary, I repeated. For now. A few minutes later, the board emerged. Harold adjusted his tie and faced the remaining investors. Given the concerns raised, he announced, the board has voted to suspend final approval of the restructuring plan pending independent legal review. The words were careful, measured. Daniel stood a few steps behind him, rigid. Additionally, Harold continued, Daniel Whitmore will step aside from executive authority during this review process. The room absorbed that slowly. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, which made it worse. Daniel leaned close to me as the announcement concluded. You just destroyed our marriage, he whispered. I met his eyes steadily. You destroyed it when you put me up for bids. There was no shouting, no tears, just clarity. I'll be retaining independent counsel, I added. His expression shifted again, from anger to something colder. You won't survive this alone, he said. I already survived tonight, I replied. Investors began to exit quietly. The staff started dimming lights that had once been theatrical and warm. The stage where I had stood under a spotlight was now dark. My phone buzzed again. EPO timeline suspended. I stared at the words for a moment. 2 years ago, I had stepped away from my own career so his could expand without complication. Tonight, I stepped into a microphone so my name wouldn't be used as insulation. As I walked toward the hotel exit, the night air outside felt sharp and clean against my skin. Daniel remained inside, surrounded by board members and lawyers. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't standing behind him. I was standing alone. And I wasn't afraid. 3 days after the gala, the official statement was released. Whitmore Technologies announced an internal compliance review and a temporary pause on the IPO timeline. The language was careful, neutral, controlled. Daniel had not come home. The house felt quieter than it ever had during our marriage. No late-night conference calls. No murmured strategy sessions behind closed office doors. Just stillness. My phone rang mid-morning. It was his mother. "You didn't need to make this public," she said without greeting. Her voice was tight. Measured in that way, wealthy families master when they're containing embarrassment. This could have been handled privately. I wasn't aware I was being handled privately. I replied, "You embarrassed the family," she said. "Charles is devastated. Charles revised his will without informing me," I said calmly. "And liability clauses were drafted referencing joint assets without my consent. That's governance," she snapped. "Bloodline protection. Spouses complicate matters." There it was. Spouses complicate matters. "I'm not asking for inheritance," I said. "I'm asking for transparency." Silence. "You were never meant to be involved in governance," she said quietly. The call ended shortly after that. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. 2 days later, I met with an independent attorney in Phoenix. I brought copies of everything I had: the will revision summary, the offshore clause reference, the transcript of Daniel's recorded sentence. She read carefully, expression neutral. "You were positioned as a buffer," she said finally. "If regulatory exposure surfaced post-IPO, liability displacement could have complicated your legal standing significantly." "Displacement," I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Containment often looks clean on paper. It isn't clean for the person absorbing it." She closed the folder gently. "Did you sign any marital restructuring documents recently?" "Post-nuptial agreement." I thought back. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel had handed me a stack of documents over dinner. "Tax planning updates," he'd said casually. I had signed them without reading every page. That night, I returned home and opened our shared digital vault. There it was. Post-nuptial agreement, revised. Dated the same week as the will revision. I opened it slowly. A clause limited my ability to challenge executive restructuring decisions tied to liability exposure. My signature was at the bottom. My stomach tightened. I checked the metadata. The document had been modified 2 days after the signature date. Modified. When Daniel came home late that evening, I placed the printed agreement on the kitchen counter. "When did this change?" I asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "It was administrative," he said. "Minor edits. The metadata shows post-signature modifications," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "The board was pressuring me. We needed insulation before the IPO. It was protective." "Protective for whom?" I asked. "For all of us," he insisted. "Protection doesn't require secrecy," I said quietly. He ran a hand through his hair. "You went public. Now regulators are circling. Investors are nervous. They're nervous because disclosure was incomplete," I answered. He looked at me as though I had betrayed something sacred. "I've retained independent counsel," I added. That landed. 2 weeks later, a family group text began circulating about Christmas at the Whitmore mansion. Caterers, guest lists, seating charts. My name wasn't included in the first thread. Ryan sent me a separate message. "You're still welcome, officially or not." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "I'll pass." I no longer wanted to sit at a table where I was decorative until inconvenient. The news cycle moved quietly but steadily. Daniel's suspension remained in place pending audit findings. The IPO stayed on hold. One afternoon, Margaret Sloan requested a meeting. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. "The board is restructuring oversight," she said. "We need someone independent to advise during the audit." I waited. "They trust you," she added. "More than they trust him right now." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same room where I had been auctioned had transformed into a boardroom without walls. "I don't want revenge," I said carefully. "This isn't revenge," Margaret replied. "It's governance." That word felt different coming from her. That night, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the last month. Humiliation, exposure, suspension, silence, opportunity. I understood something clearly now. This was never about destroying Daniel. It was about reclaiming agency. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a formal email. Invitation to serve as interim compliance liaison. Effective immediately. I read it twice. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like someone's wife orbiting a corporate son. I felt like myself. 1 month after the gala, I walked back into Whitmore Technologies headquarters without Daniel. The lobby looked the same, glass walls, polished stone floors, the company logo mounted in brushed steel behind reception, but it felt different. Employees who once greeted me with polite social smiles now straightened slightly when they saw me. Not as an accessory. As authority, I wasn't there as a wife attending a board dinner. I was there as interim compliance liaison. Margaret met me in the elevator. "Ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for weeks," I replied. Daniel's former executive office was on the top floor. As we passed it, I noticed the nameplate had been removed. The wall was clean, almost sterile, as if he had never occupied the space. Inside the conference room, the independent audit team had already assembled. Stacks of documents sat neatly organized. Digital projections of revised governance charts filled the screens. The findings were precise. The offshore structuring was not illegal, but the disclosure timing had created regulatory vulnerability. The spousal liability clause had been drafted without adequate transparency. The post-nuptial modification raised ethical questions. The room was quiet when the lead auditor finished. "The board vote to remove Daniel as CFO was unanimous," Margaret said afterward, "including his father's proxy vote. That part surprised me more than anything else. Charles Whitmore had always protected the company first. Perhaps now he understood that protecting it meant protecting its integrity. The IPO was officially postponed indefinitely. Governance transparency protocols were rewritten. Executive disclosures tightened. Any structural change tied to marital or familial assets now required documented consent. I helped draft the language. It felt strange to sit on the other side of the table. Later that week, Daniel asked to meet. We chose a neutral cafe downtown. No chandeliers. No LED screens. He looked tired. The Polish had worn thin. "I never thought you'd challenge me like that," he said. "I never thought you'd auction me," I replied. He stared at his coffee. It wasn't meant to be humiliation. It was positioning. "I know," I said. He looked up. "You turned the room against me." I turned on the lights. I corrected. Silence stretched between us. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I assumed you'd protect the marriage before the optics." That hurt more than anything else he'd said. "I protected myself," I replied. He hesitated. "Is there any way back from this?" I thought about the auction. The slide with my face labeled Lot Number 7. The post-nuptial edits. The offshore clause referencing joint assets. The word insulation. "No," I said finally. His expression tightened. "Is this about money?" "It's about dignity." I filed for divorce the following week. Christmas arrived quietly. The Whitmore family mansion hosted its annual gathering without me. I spent the day with close friends instead. Cooking. Laughing. Breathing without calculation. Ryan sent a brief message that evening. "You were right." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. 3 months later, I stood on a different stage in Denver at a corporate governance summit. My name was introduced not as someone's wife, but as a legal strategist specializing in executive accountability. The room was filled with board members, compliance officers, investors. I spoke about informed consent in corporate marriages, about hidden clauses, about the danger of confusing optics with ethics. The applause was steady, respectful. Margaret sat in the front row, nodding. As I stood there, I thought back to that night in Scottsdale. The laughter, the spotlight, the screen. The moment I took the microphone. Revenge had never been about humiliating Daniel. It had been about refusing to be collateral. The real show didn't begin when I was auctioned. It began when I spoke. At the end of my speech, I paused and looked out at the audience. "If you've ever been treated like decoration instead of a partner," I said, If you've ever been excluded from decisions that shape your own life, don't wait for permission to step forward. Silence settled gently across the room. Silence protects systems. I continued. Speaking protects you. That's what I'll leave you with. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced betrayal inside your marriage, your family business, or any place where you were supposed to be safe, tell me what you would have done. Would you have walked out of that ballroom? Or would you have taken the mic? Share your thoughts. Your experiences matter more than you think. And if you believe dignity is worth defending, stay here with us. There are more stories about turning the tables without losing yourself in the process. The night my husband put me up for bids, he thought he controlled the narrative. He forgot something. I know how to read contracts. And I know how to rewrite them.